Hello again, everyone. Dr. Toye here, tuning in for another episode of Navigational Mind. Today, we're going straight into something I see all the time, both in the clinic and honestly in my own life. Collapse. And when I say collapse, I don't mean a dramatic fainting spell or some big visible breakdown. It's quieter, more structural than that. We've talked in other episodes about the mind as a kind of house, with all its residents, the parts that make us tick. But what happens when that house crumples, even temporarily? Well, let's just say it's not a sign of being weak or broken. It's much more like what happens when too much snow piles up on a roof. Eventually, the roof just can't hold the weight. That's what collapse is. It's not your character falling short, or some deep flaw. It's a point where your personal system gets overloaded. Demands, responsibilities, emotional noise, maybe a pile-up of unresolved stuff. And suddenly, those reliable things, direction, clarity, all that lovely focus, they just slip away. The house gets noisy downstairs. Your internal residents, those voices we talked about before, go a bit haywire. One wants to run, another just wants to sleep for a week. A few get plain confused. The basement light flickers on, which for me always comes with this thick feeling of being overwhelmed, or sometimes just blankness. I'll try not to ramble, but it reminds me of a story from years back when I was running that little clinic up north. There was this week, maybe 1997 or was it 98? Let's just say it was one of those winters when the generator failed, the flu swept through half the village, and I was running on about 3 hours of sleep a night. I remember one night sitting in the supply closet, absolutely sure I was failing everyone. But, looking back, it wasn't my willpower that was the problem. It was too much load for one person to carry. Realizing that changed something fundamental for me. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't pushing harder. It's pausing to stabilize instead of blaming yourself for just being human. So why does collapse actually happen? It's, almost mechanical. There's that overload. You're juggling more balls than you've got hands. Or maybe there are bitter little disagreements among your residents. Part of you is trying to pull forward, another part pulling you back. Sometimes it's this subtler thing, structural weakness. Maybe your anchors, the things we talked about in last week's episode, your values, little routines, those touchstones that give you steadiness, maybe they're missing or shaky. Collapse looks dramatic when you're inside it, but honestly, it's pretty predictable if you trace the steps back. There's nothing mysterious or shameful here. It's what happens when the architecture can't hold the latest storm. Now, let's talk about what not to do. And if you're like me, or most of my patients, you might recognize this pattern. You start feeling the walls shake, so you try to get back on track by pushing yourself. Come on, Toye, focus. Get productive, force clarity, fix those feelings now. Does that ever work? In my experience, no. If you try to force your way to control, clarity, or productivity during collapse, you just drive the system deeper into shutdown. Real progress begins when you give yourself permission to ease off instead of pushing through. I think back to a patient, I can't mention names, who kept soldiering on until one day her body just said, "We're done." And, I might be wrong, but I think most of us have missed a dozen warning signs long before things truly fell apart. Sometimes those signs are tiny. Trouble focusing, tossing and turning at night, forgetting stuff, snapping at people, or just a sense that everything takes twice the effort. And most of us breeze past these signals. We say, "I'll deal with that later." But that's the moment to step back. If there's one thing to remember, maybe it's this. Collapse needs stabilization, not solutions. The system needs permission to pause and recover, not pressure to magically fix itself. So if collapse is sort of baked into being human, what do we do next? Let's talk about how we rebuild. Not by leaping back to business as usual, but through, well, 4 key phases. And these are not about heroics, they're about careful navigation. First off, stabilization. That means reducing demands, restoring your anchors, whether that's a quiet cup of tea at the same old corner of the table, or holding on to a good conversation. The goal is to create enough safety that the system can breathe again. Once things settle, there's this lovely, gentle phase called soft articulation. We touched on articulation in episode 5, turning fog into clarity. But after a collapse, it's softer, quieter. Maybe you just name one feeling, or write 2 honest lines in a journal. That patient I mentioned practiced this. After decades of pushing herself to burnout, she started reflecting softly, just acknowledging, I feel tired, I want rest. And slowly that gentle honesty let her see what she'd truly been carrying. With articulation comes a faint sense of direction. Maybe it's not a plan, maybe it's just an orientation. I think I want to move toward rest, or maybe, today, I step out into the garden for a breath. Then, when the time feels right, you allow yourself small, manageable steps, what I call process resumption. Not fixing it all, just moving, bit by bit, as the system regains strength. Each time you go through this, you come out with clearer limits, more honest direction, and, honestly, a slightly different sense of who you are. It's not just recovery, it's evolution. So, to wrap us up, collapse is not the end of navigation. It's actually the beginning, if you treat it not as a crisis, but as a signal. Through careful rebuilds, you make the inner house sturdier, and gradually, over months or years, you'll find yourself meeting future storms with more coherence, and maybe a little less fear. Alright, that's it for today. Take care of your house, and we'll journey on next time.